The door that never opens. Smash that like button, subscribe if you've got the nerve, and drop a comment if you think you can handle what's coming next. Because once this door closes, there's no way out. The alarm screamed through ADX Florence at 2:17 a.m., a sound so sharp it felt like it could cut steel. Red lights strobed down a corridor designed to swallow men whole. In cell range D, guards froze. One of the inmates, federal number ending in 771, wasn't responding. The observation window showed a body slumped on the concrete floor, perfectly still. No blood. No struggle. Just silence. At the clean version of hell, silence was the loudest warning of all. ADX Florence was built to erase people. 23 hours a day alone. Meals slid through slots. Human voices reduced to echoes. Inmate 771 had been transferred here months earlier after a violent incident elsewhere, an assault that left a man hospitalized and a dozen questions unanswered. Officially, he was high risk. Unofficially, guards whispered that he was breaking. But when the medical team finally entered the cell, what they found didn't fit the script. There were marks on the wall, tiny scratches, deliberate, counting something. And under the bunk, taped where cameras couldn't see, was a folded page torn from a book. 3 words were written in block letters. It wasn't here. The paper sent a chill through the command room. Because inmate 771 had never been to here before. He'd come from the past, from another prison, another nightmare. Alcatraz. The story jumped decades backward and thousands of miles west, to a rock in San Francisco Bay where the water cut like knives. In 1946, Alcatraz was already a legend, but the Battle of Alcatraz turned it into a warning. Armed convicts took control, guards were shot, Marines were called in. Smoke filled the corridors. When it was over, men were dead, others were executed, and the prison's reputation hardened into myth. Official reports closed the book. Unofficially, some chapters were torn out. One of those chapters involved a corrections officer named Thomas Hale, a man who survived the battle and never spoke publicly again. Decades later, Hale's name appeared in a sealed file connected to inmate 771, now an old man when he was finally arrested for a string of crimes that had gone cold for years. The connection was thin, almost absurd. A shared last name on a visitor log. A note referencing the Rock. Nothing prosecutors could use. But someone had noticed. Back in the present, the Bureau sent Special Agent Mara Ellison to Florence. She'd seen enough locked rooms to know when a story was lying. Ellison studied the scratches on the wall, count marks, maybe days. Or maybe something else. The folded page was from a history book about Alcatraz, the chapter describing the battle. The margins were darkened, as if someone had pressed a pen hard enough to tear the paper. 3 words circled in ink. They let him. Ellison followed the paper trail east to New York, to a place that never slept because it never rested, Riker's Island. A maze of concrete and chaos, where overcrowding turned tension into currency. Years earlier, inmate 771 had passed through Riker's awaiting trial. Records showed he'd been assaulted twice. Guards wrote it up as inmate-on-inmate violence. But surveillance logs told a Messier story, blind spots, cameras offline, reports filed late. And then there was the death. A pretrial detainee found unresponsive in a stairwell. Ruled an overdose. No autopsy photos survived. No evidence locker inventory matched. The name of the officer on duty? Thomas Hale. The same Thomas Hale from Alcatraz. The same man who should have been retired, unreachable, gone. Ellison requested the sealed box from storage, the one nobody had opened in years. Inside were photographs, letters, and a final report stamped closed. At the bottom of the box lay a key, rusted, labeled only with a number that matched a door at ADX Florence. But when Ellison returned to Colorado and ordered the door opened, the corridor cameras went dark. And behind that door, something, or someone, had already moved. The corridor lights flickered back on at ADX Florence, but the sense of safety didn't return with them. When the response team forced the door open, the cell was empty. No broken locks. No blood. No body. Just a neatly made bunk and the same scratch marks on the wall, Only now one final line had been added beneath the others. A single stroke. Completion. Special Agent Mara Allison stood in the doorway, her jaw tight. In a facility designed to prevent movement, a man had vanished without a sound. The official explanation came fast. A clerical error, a delayed transfer, a miscommunication between departments. But Ellison had spent too long chasing ghosts to accept convenient answers. Inmate 771 hadn't escaped. He'd been erased. The key from the sealed box fit another door, this one leading not to a cell, but to a records annex buried beneath the prison. Dust coated the shelves like a second skin. Boxes were stacked out of order, labels mismatched, dates overlapping. Someone had been here recently, reorganizing the past. Ellison found a ledger stamped restricted, its pages filled with incident reports from 3 prisons across 3 eras: Alcatraz, Riker's Island, and ADX Florence. Different decades. Different inmates. Same outcome. Unresponsive. No witnesses. Cases closed. What linked them wasn't violence. It was timing. Each death occurred days before a scheduled court appearance, appeal, or testimony. Men who were about to talk. Men who had seen something they weren't supposed to see. And standing near the margins of every case was the same name, sometimes misspelled, sometimes abbreviated, sometimes hidden behind a badge number that no longer existed. Thomas Hale. Ellison tracked Hale's personnel file and found gaps where promotions should have been, transfers approved without signatures, commendations awarded quietly. He was never in the spotlight. He was the man behind the door, the one who decided when it stayed closed. When Hale finally retired, he didn't disappear. He consulted, advised, sat on oversight committees that oversaw nothing and answered to no one. At Rikers, his role had been labeled temporary, necessary, emergency. That stairwell death from years earlier, reopened under Ellison's authority, told a different story now. Toxicology showed sedatives inconsistent with the victim's medical history. The camera outage that night lasted exactly 11 minutes. Long enough to stage a scene. Short enough to blame the system. Hale's report, written an hour later, used language identical to an Alcatraz incident report from 1946. Same phrasing. Same passive voice. Same absolution. As Ellison dug deeper, evidence began to vanish. A box from the annex went missing. A witness recanted, claiming confusion. An internal email warned her to narrow the scope. The message was unsigned, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't about one corrupt officer. It was about a method. Then came the call from New York. A corrections captain at Rikers had been found dead in his apartment. Officially, a heart attack. Unofficially, he'd been scheduled to meet Ellison the next morning. The captain had served under Hale during a reform crackdown and had recently requested immunity. On his kitchen table, detectives found a notebook open to a single page. 3 words were underlined twice. They let him. The phrase hit Ellison like a confession whispered too late. It wasn't just that Hale had done these things. It was that others had allowed it, out of fear, loyalty, or the belief that the men who died deserved it. Prisons didn't just hold criminals. They hid crimes. Ellison flew back to Colorado under orders to stand down. Instead, she made one last stop, an off-site storage unit registered to a shell company linked to Hale's pension. Inside were personal effects, photographs of prison corridors, maps of blind spots, and a cassette tape labeled Florence. The tape crackled to life with a calm, aging voice. "You don't understand," the voice said. "Some doors can't be opened. Some men can't be allowed out." Before Ellison could process the words, her phone buzzed with an alert from ADX Florence. Another inmate had been found unresponsive. This one wasn't supposed to be there at all. The second body changed everything. Inmate 884 wasn't on any public roster. No court date. No digital footprint beyond a single intake form stamped confidential. He had arrived at ADX Florence under a name that wasn't his, transferred in the dead of night from a federal holding facility that officially didn't exist. When guards found him, he was seated upright on his bunk, eyes open, hands folded neatly in his lap. There were no signs of a struggle. No drugs in his system. No cause of death that made sense. Mara Ellison knew why that terrified her more than the disappearance of inmate 771. This man hadn't been silenced to protect the past. He'd been silenced to protect the present. Ellison defied orders and accessed the intake file. The fingerprints didn't match the name. Facial recognition returned a hit within seconds. Older, grainier photos. A younger man in uniform standing on a rocky shoreline. Thomas Hale. Not retired. Not dead. Hidden. Hale had been brought into Florence under the same machinery he'd helped design. No trial. No paperwork trail that could be followed without clearance few possessed. He wasn't an inmate. He was a contingency. The cassette tape Ellison had recovered wasn't a confession. It was a philosophy. Hale believed prisons weren't about justice. They were about containment. When systems failed, when courts hesitated, when politics complicated punishment, someone had to decide who never walked free. Alcatraz had been the proving ground. Rikers, the expansion. ADX Florence, the final refinement. Cleaner. Quieter. Permanent. Ellison confronted the warden with the evidence. The response was measured, rehearsed. Hale had been consulting. He had information that threatened national security. His detention was authorized at a level Ellison couldn't see. When she pushed, the warden leaned back and asked a question that landed like a verdict. How many men do you think he stopped? That was the lie at the heart of it. Hale hadn't stopped crimes. He'd stopped testimonies. Inmate 771 had been one of them, a man who survived Alcatraz as a child of a guard, who later uncovered records proving the Battle of Alcatraz had been allowed to escalate to justify extreme control. When he tried to speak decades later, the same door closed on him. Only this time, he left a trail. Ellison leaked the ledger. The patterns hit the media like a detonation. Oversight committees scrambled. Hearings were announced. Names were denied. And quietly, without ceremony, Thomas Hale's death was ruled natural. Case closed. But Ellison couldn't shake one detail. The scratch marks in cell range D hadn't been days. They were numbers. Coordinates. She followed them to a decommissioned wing beneath Florence, sealed after a flood years earlier. The door at the end required 2 keys. One was missing. The other was already in the lock. Inside were cells without numbers and cameras that never connected to the main feed. On one wall, written over and over, were the same 3 words. They let him. Ellison's report vanished before it reached the Inspector General. Her access was revoked. She was reassigned, then quietly encouraged to retire. Officially, no evidence supported her claims. Unofficially, reforms were announced. Committees formed. Doors repainted. 3 months later, a detainee at Rikers Island was found dead in a stairwell during a camera outage lasting 11 minutes. The reports cited systemic failure. At ADX Florence, a new inmate arrived under a redacted name. And somewhere in the dark, a door closed without a sound. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one.